Welcome to Nixon's the One, the new Nixon in 1968. I'm Merrick Masters, a professor of business emeritus, commentator and podcaster. You can find me on my YouTube channel. To win the presidency in 1968, Richard Nixon had to do a lot of re-imaging. He did this during the so-called wilderness years, which were between the years 1962 and 1968, after he was defeated for the governorship in California and gave his famous or infamous last press conference on the morning after his defeat. The image of the old Richard Nixon, which emerged after this last press conference, was one of a loser and a sore one. Nixon had lost 2 elections in a row, one for the presidency in 1960, the second for the governorship of California in 1962. The old Nixon, in the minds of many, was highly partisan, combative, formal, corporate, and somewhat pleading. The new Nixon, which emerged in 1968 after several years of reflection, was one of a centrist, measured, intelligent, composed, and reasoned person. Nixon's image emerged to a large extent in people's minds from his checkers speech, which was given in the midst of the 1952 campaign when he was the vice presidential nominee running with Dwight Eisenhower for president. And Nixon was accused of taking money to use to finance his political activities while he was a U.S. senator. There were concerns about the ethics of that. And Nixon addressed it in a nationwide address, which really salvaged his candidacy for the vice presidency at that time. But the speech, according to many who viewed it, particularly as skeptics and critics, came across as a corny politician with an insatiable political ambition. But on Main Street, there were a lot of people who thought that he did a wonderful job in his speech. It resonated with them, and it was certainly strong enough in its popular support to save his candidacy as the vice presidential nominee in that year. Nixon's first debate with John F. Kennedy was one in which he underperformed. People had high expectations that Nixon would do very well against Kennedy, but Nixon came across as being drawn and haggard. He'd been ill before with an infection and hospitalized for 2 weeks and had just recently gotten out of the hospital. He'd lost weight and was fatigued, having been out on the campaign trail in the past few days before this debate, which occurred on September 26, 1960 in Chicago. You can find this debate in the link below, as you can find the speech, the checker speech, in the link above in the previous slide, if you want to look at it in more detail to form your own opinion. Nixon, in 1960, his television ads had him centered, speaking on the issues, so to speak, and Nixon came across as very scripted, corporate, and lawyerly. It's worth your couple minutes to watch this speech so you can compare it to his ads later in his political life in 1968, running for the presidency. Nixon gave his last press conference in 1962 after his defeat as governor, and this stamped sore loser on Nixon for a very long period of time. His closing in that memorable press conference that he gave after his defeat in that year is noteworthy for what he said, in part to the effect that I believe Governor Brown, who defeated him, has a heart, even though he believes I do not. This is Nixon speaking to the press after his defeat. Nixon went on to say, I believe he is a good American, even though he feels I am not. I leave you gentlemen now, and you will write it. You will interpret. That's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last conference. Parenthetically, at this time, there were very few, if any, women in these press conferences that were conducted, as there were few women reporters. And so he was really speaking to the crowd when he said, gentlemen. Nixon went on, as he was remaking himself, to challenge Lyndon Johnson on his policies in Vietnam. And he emerged in the campaign in the midterm elections of 1966 as the leading spokesperson for the Republican Party in loyal opposition to Johnson's policies. Johnson had conducted a peace meeting with various leaders of certain nations in Southeast Asia in the Philippines in October of 1966, and they issued a communique in which he called for certain steps to be taken to promote peace in the area. Nixon criticized that strongly. He wrote a column that was published in full in the New York Times and published on November the 4th, 1966, that attacked Johnson for his policies and raised several questions, asking such matters as, does this new Manila proposal for mutual withdrawal by the U.S. in North Vietnam mean that we are now willing to stand aloof and let the future of the South Vietnamese be determined by the victor of a military contest between the Viet Cong and the government of South Vietnam? This Nixon response to President Johnson infuriated him. At a press conference Johnson had on later that day, November the 4th, 1966, he strongly criticized Richard Nixon. You can listen to that if you go to the link below. And he said the following. Johnson said, I do not want to get in a debate on foreign policy meeting with a chronic campaigner like Mr. Nixon. It's his problem to find fault with his country and with his government during a period, October, every 2 years. And if you look back over this record, you will find that he never really did recognize or realize what was going on when he had an official position in the government, namely when he was Vice President of the United States. Nixon went on the airwaves the next day on a television news program called Issues and Answers, and answered questions from the reporters, and he expressed shock at Johnson's personal attack, but had empathy for the fact that he thought that Johnson appeared tired and petulant, and he understood that given the burdens of the presidency. Nixon assembled a new team, really starting in 1966, that worked through the election of that year, that included such figures as Roger Ailes, Lynn Garment, William Gavin, Frank Shakespeare, and Harry Treleaven. And they were the people who really designed his new strategy to run for the presidency. Haldeman, who was a marketing executive, came up with the strategy, which was to focus almost exclusively on television and not pressing the flesh through campaign rallies as a mean of reaching more people in the country through this increasingly popular medium of television. Nixon polished and honed his approach and used it in the the Nixon answer, which was a form of holding what appeared to be a press conference, but really was not. But it had all the makings of one, and Nixon used it on several occasions across the country. His television ads, which were quite different from what they were in his previous campaigns, focused on his quality as the inevitable leader at this point in time to resurrect us from the flawed policies of Lyndon Johnson. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Stay tuned for more episodes of Nixon's the One. Thank you and have a good day.